To start, that we're going to have a little question session after Professor David Hughes has given his talk. So, thanks, Don. Again, we've got Professor David Hughes to come and talk to us. David's got extensive experience working with the meat and livestock companies around the globe and is frequently in Australia. He's lived in Europe, North America, Caribbean, Africa, Southeast Asia, and he has extensive experience as an international advisory board member with food companies and organisations in 3 continents. Could you please welcome Professor David Hughes?
Right, sir. Delighted to be here. And this is big picture stuff now, so, you know, bear with me. You've got me for 40 minutes. I hope we get on, dear Lord. And I have a lovely job. I sort of wander relentlessly around the known world talking. Could just as likely to be in Latin America as in China or here or in Europe. And often I get asked initially sort of, you know, what is it in terms of looking towards the market for the future? Is it developed countries? Is it emerging countries? What sort of balance should you get? And there's this sort of growing feeling that it's about emerging markets. I can see it. You can feel the energy within an Australian context that you see, you know, your near neighbours, there's large numbers of people, their incomes are starting to go off. And so, brilliant. You've got a brilliant future ahead. But I start off, this is an old slide for me, but it's still a good one. It'll just sort of start you off. And it's to make the point that the developed countries, I come from the developed world in Europe, it may be a little slow and sleepy and going backwards at the moment. North America the same. But, you know, don't give us up yet. So let's put this up. And every Saturday morning, I get a comic. Sit down with a cup of coffee and I read it assiduously from beginning to end. It's called The Economist. And if you go back about a year or so ago now, and I saw this and I thought, wow, it's just a reminder of the size of some of the developed markets. So here we've got a map of the US, and instead of the state name, it's got the name of the country that has the same gross domestic product as the state. You got it? So, for example, California, same size as Italy. Actually, it's probably much larger now because Italy's gone backwards. Where are you? You're doing pretty well. Australia, same size as New York State. What about your Tasman cousins, you know, who like to get under your skin, and the Kiwis always like to suggest that they just push a little harder than most. When I'm in New Zealand, which I often am, I can say, you can hold your head up, New Zealand, because you're the same size as Kansas. And they sort of don't particularly like that. They thought, that's by the by. So here we are. So what's my point here? The US, slow growth and all. Canada, well, a little faster. Europe, slow growth. But that's where the wealth still is. And will be maintained for some time to come. There's not many statistics, but I'll put this up because it makes my point. What we've got here is the blue line is how does everybody compare on a per capita income basis relative to the US. So the US index is 100. What that tells in 2011 that Canada is roughly 92%, that if you're a Canadian, I'm a Canadian as well as a POM, that you're not as rich as the average American, but you're not far off. Germany, Britain, we're a little bit behind. But let's get down to the BRICS, for example, so Brazil, Russia, India, China. So here we are, China in 2011, that the average Chinese person on a per capita income point of view is what, 15%? 15% of the income of an average American. Now let's go forward 50 years to 2060, and where are we? That's 50 years, that'll see some of you guys off. You won't all be here. I certainly won't be here. And what it tells me is in 50 years' time, those old developed sleepy countries, because they're from such a high base, will still be the richest on a per capita basis. So what's the point about that? Well, I think there's a particular point is if you're in premium products, then you require rich customers. And the fact of the matter is, in those developed countries, they will continue, relatively speaking, to be rich. Don't forget about them. The problem is with them is that they're very, very slow growth. And that's why you get so interested in developing in emerging countries. So let's move on. Here we are. I thought, you know, we can all relate to beer one way or another. And it's just, this could be anything, but I just took beer. Who's in the gold medal positions? If you take, say, North America, then they are relentlessly plowing their way through 82 liters per capita. You're right up there too. God love you. And Western Europe, we're not far behind. You can see, so that's the big modern beer consumers, if you will. Whereas the Africas and the Asias, tiny. But look at the growth. In North America, Western Europe, beer consumption going backwards. And in Africa and Asia, it's going forward. So that's the future, if you will. That's where the growth is. And you could take anything. It would be cars, it could be dairy products, it could be meat. It all comes for exactly the same. Come. Why are you hiding behind there, madam? You want to shoot? Yeah. You can be excused. So why are we slow growth? Well, for a range of reasons. But the best example is Japan. I mean, population of Japan in 2010 is roughly 130 million people. Now fast forward to 2050, there'll be 30 million less Japanese in Japan in 40 years' time than there is now. Every single year from here on in, it's happening right now, the Japanese market gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Can you imagine operating in a market like that? If I look at, say, a Japanese retailer like Seiyu, which is owned by Walmart. Walmart have been there for 9 years now in Japan. They've never made a dime. Never made a dime. Every year that market gets smaller. Let's put it in meat terms. The Japanese they're not big red meat eaters, but they're big fish eaters. They eat 70 kgs of fish per person. So over the next 40 years, there's going to be 30 million less Japanese times 70 kg. That means by 2050, the market for fish in Japan will be 2.1 million tons less than it is now. You know, wow. Well, almost. So it's a really exaggerated example of what's happening in developed countries, which is slow growth. In many cases, population's not increasing. Actually, that's not the case for Australia. That's not to suggest that you are heavy-duty into procreative activities. Where does your increasing population come from? You import it. You import it. I mean, that's not to say that, well, if I look across Australia, in terms of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, they still undertake reproductive activity. Well, they certainly practice. And there are certain areas, Dubbo, for example, I believe, they're particularly, that's another matter. So here we go. So this is the sort of negative end, if you will. If I look at meat consumption and, in fact, dairy consumption across developed countries, what am I saying here? I'm saying that in low or no market growth in developed countries with existing high meat product consumption. If you take the US, Canada, most of Europe, per capita meat consumption is very high, and the expectation is that it will probably decline on a per capita basis. It will get less. Why? It's wherever you get population growth slow or declining, where you get aging population, I'm the manifestation of that. If there are concerns, for example, about health and well-being, particularly in aging societies, where there are social pressures, concerns about eating dairy products and meat. Should we feel guilty about greenhouse gases? What about this whole notion of climate-friendly diets? Whenever you hear that phrase, then you should put your backs up, because that means reduced consumption of meat and dairy products. And increasingly, particularly in a recessionary environment, for lower income groups, I would expect to see, in North America, in Europe, for example, migration to lower priced products, and that is code for meats, to white meats, or towards value processed meats, which means really cheap stuff. And is that, should we go out and cut our throats with regard to looking at markets in developed countries? Not at all. It's really interesting. You see this sort of polarization because for higher income groups, luckily I'm higher income, that I'm eating less meat, but when I eat meat, I want to eat better meat, and I'm willing to pay more for it. But just think about it. Again, in aging societies, the manifestation is here. What happens as you get older with regard to your diet? And be nice. So I'm 65 and I'm sensitive. What happens as you get older? You eat less. What do you eat less of? Meat. You eat less meat. And you may find this completely wimpish, but there's David and Susan Hughes. My wife's 64, I'm 65. If I'm buying the meat, an average portion for me would be 125 grams, and for my wife, 100 grams. So that means the Hughes family operate off, on a meal basis, a quarter of a kilo. But look, from a marketing perspective, isn't that interesting? It means that price per kilo is neither here nor there to us, because we don't buy a kilo of anything. And so we look to pay more for more, if you will, thus the opportunity. So, for example, in my market, I see dry-aged beef selling at, 30, 40 pounds, 60 to $70 Australian per kilo, increasingly on offer in retail stores, aimed at the top end of the market where people are wanting to eat less but pay more for more. I was in London the other day, and it just reminded me of the challenge with regard to high-value meat marketing. Selfridge's food hall, you'd know that. It's just sort of a dip down from Harrods. And here we've got AA Wagyu ribeye at a modest 275 Oz per kilo. And that's a sort of example of what I mean. But actually, I'd like to make another point. I went into Selfridge's. I could see the Wagyu in the case. There you are, in the second best butchers in London. It wasn't priced, and it was still in its plastic package. And what did it look like? Crap. So I asked, first of all, what was it? The butchers didn't know. They had to go and find out. Eventually, they managed to get a price on. And I said, why do you keep it in its plastic wrapper? They said, well, we don't sell much, so we don't want it to spoil. I mean, do you see that sort of? Yeah, they're not going to sell much. That's by the by. So there we go. So in my market, what do I say? You see this polarization. Meat consumption in general is declining, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the world, because at one end, it's more price for less, and at the other, we see this migration to low-price products. Here's Tesco with its .com, so it's online sales, which are very, very buoyant, and it's about higher value product. Moving on, I thought I'd just pop this in for fun, really. I was also looking for other examples of meats that were selling at the top end, and this will actually, there'll be a few people here who can relate to it. It's for the real romantic in you. For $300, you can buy a 3-tier pork pie wedding cake. Isn't that brilliant? Yeah. No. As I say, it's only for the romantic. There we go. But something else I think we have to come to terms with is, in developed countries, in particular, we start to see this sort of pushback, if you will, about, again, related to meat consumption. So from the US, what do we see? Meatless Mondays. And again, I would expect to see more and more of this going forward. Do we have to panic? No, after all, there are 7 days in the week. Meatless Mondays is just saying, well, let's take one day and remove meat from the menu. But the point I've put in here is this from last month, that Los Angeles public schools, for example, are actually implementing a Meatless Monday. And I'd expect to see a lot more of that. So a little bit of a threat, if you will, in developed countries. But what about the emerging markets and the markets that you get really, really excited about? And this is the sort of big picture stuff here. Okay, we're about 7 billion people, all right? 2011, 2012, 7 billion people. Now, is that a lot? And I'd suggest, I mean, I don't know if you think too, but through the global financial crisis, sort of a billion has been devalued. I mean, you can still, it's only a billion. It's only a billion. But a billion's a lot. I emigrated to Canada in August 1973, which is 40 years ago, and the population of the world in 1973 was 3.5 billion. In my professional lifetime, we've doubled the world population and managed, largely, we fed those additional 3.5 billion. And what we're going to do over the next 40 years is probably add another couple of billion. And that's not a fancy forecast. It's very, very likely we'll go from 7 to about 9 billion by 2050. But actually, if you look at the big numbers, the big picture, we're going to add 1 billion to Asia and add 1 billion to Africa. Why you guys get excited is that additional billion in Asia. They're already at high levels of population. We're adding another billion, and their incomes are going up. Brilliant. What does that suggest? More protein, whether it be meat or dairy products, for example. So if I look at those numbers, what I'm intrigued by, I used to live in Africa for 4 or 5 years, that we're looking at doubling the population of Africa over the next 40 years. And I'm not sure whether that's a huge food marketing opportunity or a social problem. And I think maybe the jury's still out. We can't be negative about Africa because some of the fastest growing countries on an economic basis are in Africa right now. But we're doubling the population over the next 40 years. As I say, what you get interested in is that extra billion that are your near neighbors. Clearly a great opportunity. All the other regions, we might see growth there too, apart from Europe, which is going backwards in terms of population. But they're so low in terms of total population, it doesn't really matter. So, can we start to celebrate about the fact that you're right on the doorstep of great population growth from a high level and income growth? And I'm saying, well, yes, I go to conference after conference where, in terms of looking at international demand for protein, everybody's very, very positive, and I'm positive going forward, but I think there are a couple of wrinkles we should take care of first. And the first is, this little graph here is global food price indices, looking at what's happened to global food prices over, in this particular case, it starts at 1990 and goes through to 2013. But if I went back to when I moved to Canada, 73, 74, 75, between 1975 and 2006, globally, food prices were relatively stable and in real terms actually declined. I mean, it's a wonderful period for consumers. This was the supermarket era, the Walmart everyday low prices, always lower prices, and it largely happened. And then, what's happened on the last, since 2006? What's gone on? What's all this about? This here, what's it about? And if we move to 2020, you tell me, if we had the ability to go to 2020 and then look back through this decade, what would you expect to see in terms of these prices here, this movement? What would the trend look like in 2020? Looking back, do you think it's going to go back to low and stable? No? No? What's it more likely to be? I think it's going to be volatile. I think it's going to be up and down, and maybe edging upwards. Okay, so what's the implications for you of that? Well, I'd suggest what we need to look at is, look at your emerging markets around you. What proportion of their income do they spend on food? Out of interest, what proportion of, in Australia, what proportion of household income is spent on food in Australia? Sorry? Mr. Hughes, 50%. I'm not including booze. It's about, let's say it's 12. It's 12. What would it be in the Philippines? It's certainly 50%. If you're in Manila, you're probably spending at least half, if you're a household in Manila, you're spending at least half your total income on food. So, what's my point? Let's just nip back here. What's the staple in the Philippines? What do they eat most of? Rice. Rice. What happens if the price of rice sometime over the next 5 to 7 years for the remainder of this decade doubles? What happens to that lady who's shopping in the local market? How much more does she pay for her rice if the international price doubles? She pays double. And I think we're going to see this sort of volatile pressure on staple food prices. And I think we should keep this in mind, because if that happens, then she will constrain her purchases of special things like meat, which are discretionary, and focus on affording those staples for a family. So keep that in the back of your mind, that their populations are increasing, their incomes may be increasing, but if we get increased volatility in staple food prices, it will have a negative impact on demand in emerging countries for protein foods, I can assure you. And also, let's remember too that they're different markets to ours. They have different culinary traditions and heritages. And just taking, this is from a PhD I was marking back a couple of years ago, looking at sort of shopper behavior for fresh foods, and this is an example of beef in Malaysia. So how do they use beef in Malaysia, particularly in Muslim families? And here we are, stir-fried, soup, red-green curry, boiled with soy sauce or rendang. And it's just a reminder of how important it is to get under the skin of the consumer, of the shopper in these emerging countries, because they're different to us. And I would suggest here two things: that they value the front end probably as much as the back end, if not more, opposite to us, and that in many cases, whatever the species being used, let's say it's beef, sliced thinly, covered in a delicious sauce, you wouldn't know if it was chicken or beef. So I think we have some challenges here. So when I'm in China, and I'm often there, I mean, a quick way of looking at market research is, I wonder what they eat in southern China. Just go and see what supermarkets are selling. In this particular case, it was Tesco from the UK that have a good position in China. And so what's the big eight from a Chinese point of view, if you're a regular Chinese family household? It's about fish, it's about pork, it's about chicken, and it's about fruit and vegetables. And they're different to us. They're different the way they put a meal together. Let's look, how do Australians put a meal together? What do you start with? You start with a plate. Actually, in your case, you start with a big plate. A bloody big plate. And what do you put in the middle of it? Something about that size. That's actually a Canadian example. Back to Don talking about larger cattle. You put a great whack of red meat in the middle, and then you dot round it bits of other stuff just to make it look half decent. And that's mine. Not yours, it's mine. I just watched last night, and I'm going to eat all of it. And if I don't, I'll feel guilty, because what about the starving of Africa? I've never fully understood that link. But there we go. So that's how you construct a meal. Actually, that's how a meal is constructed in North America and also in the UK. So how do the Chinese go about it? Well, here I am sitting down with the mum and dad of my interpreter when I was in Hangzhou city the other day. There are 8 dishes. There's some vegetable one. There's a little bit of fish. What did they say? Here we are. Fish balls at the top there. Best part of the fish. Vegetables, chicken. There's a complete range. There's a balance of colors, of size. And you don't finish it. You always leave something. It's just completely different. And what about, this is a little bit complex, but I was intrigued, and it's got a Rabo connection here, that what we see is the development of meat consumption in Taiwan, which are these little blue dots. And that's sort of linking meat consumption to growth in income. And what sort of completely intrigues me is that the little diamonds, here they are, these little diamonds here, that's what's happening in China. China is just tracking exactly what's happened in Taiwan. And I don't think we should be surprised at that. They're the same people. And what I'd be doing if I was looking to export to China to get a better feel for China, apart from going there on a regular basis, is just seeing what lessons we've learned from Taiwan, because it seems they're going in exactly the same trajectory as far as I can see. But the intriguing thing about China is that it's an emerging country, but actually meat consumption currently is high. So it's actually, roughly, I don't know if I believe this or not, but this is what all the statistics say. If I put in fish, that actually China is a significant consumer of meat already. If you add in fish. But of course, the big numbers there are percentages. So if you take 2/3 of total meat consumption in China is fish and pork. Let's add in chicken, and we're up to 85% of meat consumption is chicken, fish, and pork, the preferred meats in many respects. Then we've got offal, whatever it comes from, whatever species, at a significant. So, beef, yes, it's important, but it's 7% of total consumption. Will it grow? Yes, it will grow, but it is not necessarily the preferred meat, with sheep right at the top just a little. So what I did, I thought I'd look at what happened to world meat consumption over a 5-year period, 2007 to 2012. And actually, it looks good. Initially, what do we see is over that period, world meat consumption increased by, what, 16 million tons. Brilliant. You're in the meat business. But actually, if you start to look at the detail, beef consumption globally went backwards, and most of the increase was for white meat, particularly chicken, and through emerging countries. So I thought, okay, how much of that was related to China? So I backed China off that. What did it tell me? 10 of the 16 million tons of increase globally in meat consumption over the last 5 years was because of an increasing meat consumption in China. Back to what's already been said this morning, whatever happens in China has a disproportional impact on global meat demand. Why? Because there's 1.3 million of them, and if 1 billion of them, and if 1.3 billion of them elect to eat 1 kilo more each of, say, beef, that's 1.3 million tons additional demand for just a little tick up in one country. So what does that tell me? It tells me, excellent, but fingers crossed that things continue to canter along nicely in China. Because if they stumble, we all stumble. And do I expect to see them just grow at 8% on a compound basis? No. There will be stumbles. That rate of growth will be moderated. And that will have an impact. You know, yes, it's a rosy future, but there'll be ups and downs. I suggest if you're in the meat business that you've got every reason to be optimistic, but wear a crash hat and do up your seatbelt. Because it's not going to be just sit back and enjoy the ride. On we go. Because, particularly if you take beef and lamb are clearly premium products. I think we should celebrate that. If I look internationally, then beef prices are more than double internationally the next species down, which will be pork. And I think that gives us, that's wonderful to be in a premium meat, but it reminds us that we have to explain to shoppers and to consumers why they should pay twice as much more. Remind me again why I should pay twice as much more for your beef rather than pork, because, ... We've got to be able to finish that sentence. I love this. It's just on the side. Here we are, China, you know, communist society. And the question was, capitalism is a system that works well and should be preserved. That was agreed by 65% of Chinese and 15% of French. Says a lot, doesn't it? There we go. Moving on. So what else has happened? Just sort of racing through towards the end here. If I look at sort of developed countries in particular, where I do a lot of work, is it all about lower price as we go through the global financial crisis, as we try and get ourselves out of recession? No, it's, on the one hand, it's about value, good, affordable prices, but it's also about values. It's about ethics. It's about sustainability. It's about provenance. It's about heritage. It's about welfare, etc. And to some extent, as I wander around the developed world, I notice that in the modern food industry, everything's not quite right. And there is an influential group who think we've got it fundamentally wrong in the modern food industry. And they say that we're threatening the health and well-being of the planet. This is issues relating to sustainability, climate change, etc., that we're hurting consumers, food safety, obesity, we're not telling the truth about labeling, and also that we're abusing farm animals and threatening small-scale farmers, etc. And in the US, in Europe, there's an influential special interest group pushing an agenda here. I was in the US last week, actually in Canada. So here I'm in Whole Foods, no hormones, etc. If I'd gone back 10 years ago, this would have not been an issue. Here we are, Canada again, the number one retailer, Loblaws, free from hormones, etc. If we look at evidence that's related to, say, health to consumers, this is a map of the US showing the prevalence of self-reported obesity among US adults. And as you can see, something like, most of the map suggests that it's 25 to 30% of that 320 million population report themselves as being obese. I mean, luckily, in Australia, you can relax in this regard. I mean, it's one of the most peculiar things, as I go around the world, that there's a general view of Australians that they are young, blonde, slim, lightly and attractively tanned, jump over small buildings at one stride, And that's the perception, which I think is brilliant, particularly given that, in fact, you're all as round as puddings. There we go. So, you know, you're not alone here. And we see this sort of attack, if you will, on the modern food industry. This is just 2 books that have come out this year on salt, sugar, fat, and where again it said the modern food industry is creating this problem of obesity. We have to change the way we go about producing our food. And what does that mean? I think it affects all of us, because increasingly what we're going to see is governments will regulate in the health area. I mean, up to date, they've been saying it's your responsibility. Try and get more exercise. Try and eat healthier. They've turned around to the food industry and say, if you can, cut back on fat, sugar, and salt. But we're getting increasingly to a stage where they're saying the cost of the health costs associated with type 2 diabetes, for example, is so high, we just can't afford this, and we will regulate. And we're starting to see this on particularly fat tax on sugary drinks. Mayor Bloomberg has just been put in place, but this is salt on bucket-sized fizzy drinks. Denmark imposed a saturated fat tax on butter, for goodness sake, but then rescinded it. But I would expect to see lots more in this area. And so we've got to look at our products and say, how are we placed in that regard? So again, in Canada, here's Loblaws, the major retailer, where they'll say, we will star foods. And so we've got seafood here, we've got some salmon, which gets 3 stars. The pork actually gets 3 stars too. Is our product on this retail shelf, will it do well when it comes to regulation? I think it gives us some challenges. But the intriguing thing, not everybody decides to go the health and well-being route. The fastest growing premium burger chain in the US is called Five Guys. And I tried one the other day, and this is, if you take the bacon cheeseburger with large fries and a cola, it delivers a modest 1,800 calories. That's way to go. That's enough for a meal for the day. So you don't necessarily have to go health and well-being, but you might be regulated. Racing towards the end, let me talk about my own country and what's happened more recently. We've had a lot of fun in this whole area. Is it serious? It's very, very serious. Here's the Daily Star, which, like your tabloids, isn't really for the cerebral. What do they say? The news, the goss, the pics, the sport. It largely focuses on women with advanced bosoms, as far as I can see. And this was just from last month. Queen eats horse. Dodgy meat served at Royal Ascot. And there she is looking at that gorgeous black horse and going, yummy. So, was this a big issue? I think it's a fundamental and very big issue. It was perceived as being of concern but amusing because it wasn't seen as a food safety threat. It was seen as a food integrity threat, that you didn't tell the truth. But for some, let's take Findus, which is in Europe a very well-known brand. That's been virtually destroyed. I think it's gone. 99% horse meat in Findus beef lasagna. What did it do to retailers? If we take Tesco, the #1 retailer in the UK, and the #3 global retailer, there's been a succession of apologies at the most senior level where they say, we've let you down, shoppers, and we're going to radically change the way we configure our beef supply chains, our meat supply chains, our fresh food supply chains. We're going to deal with fewer people. We want shorter supply chains. This is serious stuff for our industry. This is what happened immediately afterwards. Shelves were just emptied by retailers. All frozen meat products gone. And then back to, here we go. On the right. Yeah. Let's run before they find us. Yeah. I mean, it's brilliant, isn't it? It's, but then some pretty mega brands like IKEA, had to face this horse's head because of their meatballs. I mean, that's done serious damage to that great Swedish retailer. So, this is serious stuff. And it's wherever I go in the meat industry, we see the same. I'm in Canada again. If we went in February, was it January, February? In Alberta, it was XL Foods, and there was an E. coli problem. And here's a retailer I was working with called Sunterra saying, we have nothing to do with XL Foods beef. They went bust. and actually they were bought by JBS, who now own XL Foods. But then this is the public relations that you see. Here's Alberta trying to build a beef industry, and this is the sort of dark cartoons that were in the Calgary Herald. Alberta beef reputation. Who came out of it? Well, the McDonald's of this world came out really, really well across Europe, where there was no incidence of horse meat in their burgers. They have very tight supply chains there. They did brilliantly, actually. So, just to finish it off, Chairman, what do I want to say? What do I want to leave with you? I think the future is bright for global meat demand. I really do. But watch out for high, volatile food prices, because that will diminish demand from those emerging countries for discretionary products like meat. Watch out for regional economic hiccups, because it won't be all plain sailing, and if something happens in China, watch out. That's one. If you're in beef, just to reiterate, remember you double the price internationally of the next one down, which is pork. You've got to be able to finish the sentence. There's a shopper with your product in her hand, and she's saying, I'm willing to pay twice as much for this beef than I am for this pork or chicken product because ... Finish that sentence. So remind shoppers, consumers, why beef and lamb prices deserve to be twice that of pork and chicken. I mean, I'd expect to see DNA testing for meat increasingly the norm across the globe. It removes the risk. And if I look, I mean, you have good regulation in Australia, but none of us are in a position where we can say there's no risk here. If we get into DNA testing, it removes the risk of Rougate and Camelgate disasters. And you know, can't you see them coming? Could I see it? Am I prescient in my own market? A ton of horse meat, £1,500. A ton of beef, £4,500. The product, when cooked and actually pre-cooked, indistinguishable to consumers, to shoppers. Are we surprised that there's been some movement between? Not at all. We know what the meat industry can be like. It has to have strong regulation. Meat scandals, food safety, animal welfare concerns are transforming supply chain relationships to safeguard the integrity of national and big trade brands. I think what you've seen recently in Europe will have a lasting impact around the world in terms of supply chain relationships. The big brands are saying, boy, we better shorten those supply chains. We better be dealing with suppliers of the very highest integrity. And what's more, I think it's really, it doesn't matter if it's in live or it's in process from an Australian point of view, the risks of being low integrity are so high for Australia and for its brands that you've really got to work hard in this area, I would suggest. What about live animal export futures? What do I know about it? But my view is your future relies on gaining society's permission to operate. You know, there are things you can do in science or in commerce, but there are things that society decide you should do, and we have to listen to what society tells us. And so I think if I was in your business, I'd want to prepare for the very best for a great future, but make sure that I've got plan B, C, and D in place. I'm encouraged when I see beef processing going in Darwin, for example. And we need complete transparency in supply chains, whether it be live and processed. It's fundamental to building consumer trust. And just to finish off here, look, I spent a lot of time in Australia, and I was in Wembley in Perth back a few years, just living in Perth for 4 months, just working off them. And I was just checking out one of the Coles of Woolworths, I'm that sad. And I was walking through a shopping mall in Wembley, Perth, and the sole of my shoe fell off. It did. And I thought, bugger. So I picked it up and I thought, I wonder if I can get it fixed. Or should I just buy a new pair of shoes? You know, I can afford that. And in every shopping centre in Australia, I don't know if you noticed, you can generally find an old-fashioned cobbler. And peculiarly enough, a lot of them are of Italian extraction. And so I took my shoe off, and and there was one, walked up to the guy who was sort of tapping away, and I said to him, looking at my shoe and then looking at him, he was still tapping away, and I said, excuse me, can you give me some advice? And he didn't look up. He said, sure, listen to your mama and don't drive too fast. And, you know, I sort of thought about that, and it's profound in its way, isn't it? And I thought I might leave that with you. Thank you.